Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take a look at some of the development tools that we are going to be using. And specifically what we're going to do is we're going to focus on some options for an editor or an environment that you will use to develop your code. Now, this video is not meant to be a comprehensive view on development tools. As a matter of fact, this will be followed up with some additional videos focusing on other development tools that we'll be using. But instead, we want to focus on the tools that you will use to write your source code. And so to begin with, what we want to do is we want to look at the difference between an editor and an environment. And to begin with, we want to talk about what is a source code editor. Well, effectively, a source code editor is a tool possibly as simple as Notepad or TextPad that simply allows for you to type in the code for the source code in your native language or in the language that you're trying to develop in. And fundamentally, it doesn't really have to have any additional features. However, to make your job easier, one of the things that you'll be looking for in a source code editor will be the ability to have syntax highlighting. Now, keep in mind that is not necessary. It depends on your familiarity with the language. However, though, especially when you're learning a language, syntax highlighting is extremely advantageous because it'll help you identify your mistakes quicker, and in some cases even give you some suggestions. Along those same lines, you may have things like auto indentation, curly brace completion, etc. But those are, once again, not required even in a source code editor. Those are just some of the convenience features that you would be looking for. Another feature of a source code editor is going to be the ability to add language support. In other words, out of the box, it may only come supporting one or two languages, and then by some sort of addition of extensions or plugins, maybe something as simple as adding a file to a specific directory, then you can get additional language support. One characteristic, though, of the source code editors is they're generally considered to be lightweight, meaning that they have a small memory footprint on your disk drive, as well as perhaps a small memory footprint in RAM. And that is one of the significant advantages with a source code editor, particularly if you're only going to use it for a short while or for a few projects that you're very familiar with the language already. These can be a great option. The last thing that you want to remember when it comes to the source code editors is their primary focus is supposed to be on editing code. And so any additional tools, for instance, like a debugger or a file manager, will generally have to be linked via an external mechanism. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you just want to be aware of that. Now, when we take a look at the integrated development environments, or IDEs, you'll see that we have a lot more expected features. Now, given development environment may not have all of these, however, though, you will come to find patterns or expectations in these development environments. And generally speaking, in addition to syntax highlighting, automatic indentation, you should see things like code completion, the ability to refactor code through multiple files, not just simply a Control F or Control H, where you can do a find and replace in a single file, or perhaps over an entire project or an entire solution. You also can expect version control, maybe even some sort of file upload mechanism. Generally speaking, they will include some sort of debugging mechanism. Code search, for instance, maybe looking for the first instance of or the implementation of a particular function. Some IDEs will also provide visual programming aspects. The best example of this that I can give you is going to be the ability to develop a form or a panel using drag and drop GUI options, for instance, be able to add a button to a form. There are other versions of visual programming, but that's probably going to be the first one that you're going to see. And once again, not all IDEs support this, but these are some common features that you're going to see. About the language support, it's a little bit different than in the editors in that, generally speaking, these IDEs are focused on one or more primary languages, and then they have secondary support for additional languages. And usually this language support then comes along with those compilers and debuggers that I mentioned earlier, and they usually are set up at installation time with limited options to add later on. Now, if you do have an IDE where you have the ability to add these features later on, once again, through some sort of plugins or extensions, you may see a second tier level of support. For example, you may only get syntax highlighting, or you may only get automatic indentation, but you may not, for instance, get compiling immediately out of the box or debugging. And so what you may see in one of these IDEs is different level of support for different languages, with the IDE focusing on one or two primary languages or primary purposes. So what are our options? Well, this is just a short list. This is definitely not intended to be comprehensive. As a matter of fact, we'll take a quick look at a website, Wikipedia page that will go through some of the options a little bit deeper. I'll also provide you with the link to that page. But what you want to do is you want to sort of break this down into two categories. You have the source code editors, such as Notepad++, Vim, and Visual Studio Code, whose primary focus is on editing the code. And then, for instance, if you want to launch an external tool, you'll probably find yourself going to the command line or to the terminal to do so, and then bouncing back and forth between the editor and that external tool. Once again, there's no issues with that. It's just which way you want to go and what do you want to become comfortable with and what do you find convenient. The second group is going to be these integrated development environments, such as Visual Studio. Whether you look at the Community or Enterprise Edition, doesn't really matter. The Enterprise Edition is available for STEM students in many cases through the Microsoft Azure portal. But you also have tools like Apache NetBeans. Apache NetBeans actually can fall under both categories. In other words, out of the box, it comes with Java support. And then you can add additional language support as you need it. And in those additional languages, you may find that NetBeans runs very similar to these code editors and focuses on things simply like syntax highlighting. And so which one do you choose? Well, first and foremost, you want to look at the language support needed, and specifically not just the language itself, but also the level of support that you need. If all you need is syntax highlighting, then you may have more options at your disposal. If you're also going to be doing perhaps web development or remote systems development, you want to take a look at the level of integration that some of the tools provide. For instance, the full-fledged IDEs may provide you with some way to interact with a web server or with some sort of remote client, whether it be through FTP or through some other sort of file storage mechanism. However, things like debugging, compiling, etc., those may not be available in those source code editors, or you may find yourself once again bouncing outside of the source code editor to the console to do an additional step. I guess the best analogy that I could give you when making the decision between the two is how familiar do you want to become with those tools? In other words, do you prefer to work more hands-on and very closely with the tools? Then I highly suggest that you look into these source code editors. It gives you more of a raw appreciation of what's going on. However, if you're more interested just in the abstraction and, for instance, the ability to see your code running remotely or debugging your code remotely, then perhaps one of these IDEs is a better choice for you. The other thing to consider is how much you plan on using the tools. Once again, if it's just something that you're going to use once, maybe for a specific project, then oftentimes these lightweight source code editors are a good choice. Now, before I leave you, I want us to take a quick look at a list of integrated development environments. This covers not only the integrated development environments, but also some of the source code editors as well. This is nothing more than a Wikipedia article. However, though, they do keep it up to date. And we're just going to pick on a couple of languages here. You can see, for instance, there's our C and C++ support. And because it's an older language, you can imagine that there is a ton of support out there for C and C++. The other one that I want us to take a quick look at is going to be a language like PHP, which arguably is an older language, but you'll see that it has less support than a language like C. And that is because there's a component of that client-server relationship there, as well as you'll notice that some of the licenses are proprietary. And this is relevant because if you take a look at how Visual Studio, for instance, supports PHP, it is through a plugin. However, it is through a licensed pay-for plugin. And you have tools like NetBeans, for instance, that the PHP features fall under the Apache license. And so once again, there's another aspect of this that you want to take a look at is not only the level of integration that is supported, but also to the types of licenses that are required for a given support. So to make a long story short, which one do you choose? Well, the answer is there isn't one answer. And I realize that seems like I am sort of tricking you, but the reality of it is that there isn't one perfect answer. Sometimes you'll want to install a couple of different IDEs to get familiar with multiple different environments. For instance, the Visual Studio is something that's oftentimes used in a professional setting. Even the Visual Studio Community Edition, the professional and the enterprise editions are used when there's a team environment involved. Likewise with NetBeans, it once again depends on a number of factors. And so I would highly, highly encourage you to get good at using a couple of different IDEs and source code editors because it will simply benefit you in the future. Hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and thank you for watching.